A steel door hidden beneath an abandoned mountain cabin unlocked itself the moment the German shepherd touched it. But what waited below knew the veteran's name. The underground lights flickered on one by one as Jack froze halfway down the concrete stairs. Atlas stood perfectly still, ears locked forward, staring into the darkness without making a sound. Somewhere deeper inside, an old machine rumbled to life, and a dusty monitor flashed a name Jack hadn't seen in decades. His pulse hammered as the cold air carried the scent of diesel and damp stone, and something beneath the mountain began to move. Before we dive in, where are you watching from today? The morning began with frost clinging to the windshield of an old blue pickup parked beside an abandoned logging road in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The truck hadn't moved in 3 days. Its paint had faded beneath years of weather, and the driver's side door creaked every time it opened. But it was still the closest thing Jack Mercer had to a home. He woke before sunrise, the way he always did. Not because he wanted to, because sleep never stayed long. The cold had settled deep into his left knee again, the one that never healed properly after Afghanistan. He sat up slowly beneath a worn army blanket, rubbing the joint until it loosened enough to bend. Beside him, Atlas lifted his head from the passenger seat. The German shepherd watched Jack for a moment, before stretching carefully, favoring his old shoulder just enough that only someone paying close attention would notice. "You still checking on me?" Jack muttered with a tired smile. Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail. Jack reached into a paper sack and counted what remained. A $20 bill, a 10, a 5, 2 ones, and 9 wrinkled quarters, $47. He folded the money with deliberate care and slipped it back into his wallet. He had counted it 4 times before falling asleep the night before. It hadn't changed. Outside, dawn painted the ridges with pale blue light. The mountains looked peaceful from a distance, hiding the scars left by abandoned mines, washed-out roads, and forgotten towns. Jack understood mountains. They carried damage quietly. He stepped outside, stretching stiff muscles while Atlas circled the truck, nose low, reading the ground the way only a trained working dog could. Every few yards he paused, sniffed, then moved again, satisfied nothing had wandered too close during the night. Jack walked toward the convenience store at the edge of the highway. He bought 1 cup of black coffee. Nothing else. The cashier nodded politely. She had seen him enough times over the past month to stop asking questions. As Jack stepped back outside, a metal dumpster lid slammed shut behind the building. The sound cracked through the cold air like a rifle shot. Before thought could catch up, his body had already moved. Coffee flew from his hand. He dropped behind the truck parked beside him, one knee hitting gravel, eyes scanning rooftops, tree line, windows, left, right, high ground. No movement. His breathing shortened. His fingers curled around nothing because the rifle that had once belonged there hadn't been in his hands for years. Someone laughed. A teenager carrying trash bags stared at him with wide eyes. "Sir, you okay?" Jack blinked. The mountains returned. The parking lot returned. There was no contact, no incoming fire, only an embarrassed silence. Atlas had already crossed the lot. Without making a sound, he pressed his shoulder gently against Jack's side, not pushing, not demanding, simply reminding him where he was. Jack rested one hand on the dog's neck until his breathing slowed. "I'm here," he whispered. Atlas stayed exactly where he was. 20 minutes later, they drove toward the county courthouse, where the monthly tax auction was already gathering a small crowd. Jack hadn't come expecting much, mostly curiosity. Old farmland, collapsed barns, flood-damaged trailers, properties no bank wanted anymore. Near the end of the list, the auctioneer cleared his throat. "Next item. 1 mountain cabin. 43 acres. Structure sold as is. Property has been vacant for, let's see. He glanced at the paperwork. About 22 years. A few people chuckled. One man in a camouflage jacket called out, "Nobody's getting inside that place anyway." Another laughed. "House is locked tighter than Fort Knox." "The old Mercer place," someone muttered. "They say folks hear generators running up there at night." "Nah," another answered. "Just wind. No electricity. No road maintenance. No water service. And the lock's never been opened." The auctioneer shrugged. Opening bid. $400. Silence. No hands. No voices. Jack looked down at the brochure. The picture showed an aging cabin perched against a rocky hillside, surrounded by dense hardwood forest. The porch leaned slightly. Moss covered part of the roof. The front door carried an oversized iron lock, unlike anything built in recent decades. Something about the place refused to let go of his attention. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was simply that nobody else wanted it. The auctioneer sighed. "We'll reopen bidding at $40 for tax recovery." Still nothing. Jack slowly reached into his pocket. $47. Everything. He looked at Atlas. The dog sat quietly beside him, ears forward, watching the photograph instead of the crowd. Jack almost laughed at himself. "What are we doing, partner?" Atlas never looked away from the page. Jack lifted one hand. "I'll bid 47. Several heads turned. Someone snorted. "You serious?" The auctioneer looked surprised. $47? Jack nodded. "That's what I've got." Silence stretched across the courthouse lawn. Finally, the auctioneer struck the gavel. Sold. The laughter started before Jack even signed the paperwork. "Hope you packed bolt cutters. You'll be sleeping outside." That mountain eats people. Jack ignored every word. An hour later, his pickup crawled along a narrow gravel road climbing higher into the Appalachian Hills. The forest thickened. Phone service disappeared. The road became little more than two muddy tire tracks winding through old oaks and towering pines. By late afternoon, the cabin finally appeared. It stood exactly as the faded photograph had promised. Weathered, silent, waiting. The iron lock still hung from the front door. Jack stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath his boots. Atlas climbed the steps behind him, then suddenly stopped. His ears stood tall, his body stiffened, but he wasn't looking at the locked front door. He turned slowly toward the back wall of the cabin. He walked to it without making a sound. Then he sat. Eyes fixed on the weathered boards. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stared, as though someone, or something, was waiting on the other side. Jack stood motionless on the porch, studying Atlas instead of the wall. The German Shepherd had worked enough search patterns during his rescue years that Jack trusted one rule above all others. Dogs didn't waste attention, especially trained ones. Atlas wasn't frightened. He wasn't aggressive. He was listening. The late afternoon wind drifted through the pines, carrying the smell of damp leaves and old cedar. Somewhere deeper in the valley, a crow called once before the forest settled into complete silence. Jack finally reached for the oversized iron lock hanging from the front door. Its weight surprised him. Cold. Solid. Hand-forged decades before anyone thought convenience mattered. He ran his fingers across the weathered steel and found tiny scratches surrounding the keyway. Not random. Tool marks. Someone had tried to force it open years ago. Several times. They had failed. Hell of a welcome, Jack muttered. Inside the auction paperwork was a small envelope taped beneath the deed. He hadn't bothered opening it earlier. Now he pulled it free. One key, blackened brass, older than the lock itself. The key slid inside with almost no resistance. When he turned it, the mechanism answered with a deep metallic click that echoed through the cabin. Atlas finally looked away from the back wall. The front door eased inward. Cool air drifted outside. Not stale, cool, as though the cabin had somehow been breathing while nobody lived inside it. Jack waited. Old habits. He never entered unknown spaces immediately. His eyes swept left, right, upper corners, windows, possible cover. No movement, no contact, he whispered automatically, before catching himself. Atlas crossed the threshold first. His nose worked steadily across the wooden floorboards, but instead of racing from room to room, he moved with careful precision, almost as if following a scent that was days or years old. Jack stepped inside. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of evening sunlight. The cabin should have looked abandoned. Instead, it looked paused. A cast-iron stove stood against the far wall. Someone had stacked split oak beside it with almost military precision. Shelves held rows of canned food. Every label had faded. Every expiration date had passed years ago. Yet each can faced forward, aligned perfectly. Nothing had tipped over. Nothing had been looted. A faded Army Corps field jacket still hung beside the door. Jack walked toward it slowly. His fingers stopped on the shoulder patch. United States Army Corps of Engineers. Old issue. Vietnam era. Whoever had lived here had known soldiers, or had been one. Atlas ignored everything. He returned to the rear wall. Again. This time he lowered his nose near the stone fireplace. One slow inhale. Another. Then he sat, watching. Jack knelt beside him. "What have you got?" Atlas pressed his nose against one section of stone before stepping back. Jack wrapped his knuckles across the fireplace. Solid. Again. Solid. Another stone. Solid. Nothing sounded unusual. Yet Atlas refused to move. "We'll come back." Outside, darkness settled quickly over the mountains. There was no power, no cell signal. Jack found an old oil lantern hanging near the kitchen sink. To his surprise, there was still fuel inside. He lit it. Warm amber light pushed shadows into the corners of the room. He cooked the last can of beef stew from his truck over the stove and shared half with Atlas. The dog ate quietly before returning to the fireplace once more. Jack almost laughed. "You planning to guard that wall all night?" Atlas simply laid down facing it. Hours passed. The mountain became silent. Jack spread his army blanket across an old cot he had found in one corner. The mattress was dry. No mold. No rodent nests. Someone had prepared this place to survive time itself. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly. Then a sharp metallic clank. His eyes snapped open. Before his mind caught up, his body had already rolled from the cot. The flashlight was in his hand, his back pressed against the wall. He scanned the room and practiced sectors. Door, window, fireplace, kitchen, clear. Only then did he hear the truth. A loose metal cup hanging above the sink had swayed in the breeze, sneaking through a cracked window frame. No mortar rounds, no incoming, no shouting over a radio, just wind. Jack lowered the flashlight. His breathing remained uneven. Atlas had crossed the room without making a sound. The shepherd leaned gently against Jack's leg, grounding him, the same way he always did. Jack rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Thought I left that over there." He never said the word Afghanistan aloud anymore. He didn't have to. The mountains knew silence. So did he. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the porch. Jack carried a bucket toward a small spring downhill, while Atlas ranged quietly through the trees, never venturing farther than he could still see his owner. When they returned, Jack noticed something odd. Fresh pine needles lay scattered beneath the fireplace. Not many. Only a few. He frowned. There weren't any pine branches inside the cabin. He crouched beside the stonework again. One narrow gap between two rocks held a tiny fragment of green moss. Cleaner than the rest, as though one stone had shifted. Not recently, but sometime. Jack slid the blade of his old pocket knife into the seam. The stone moved, barely, just enough for fine gray dust to trickle onto the hearth. Atlas stood immediately, his ears lifted. His tail became perfectly still. Jack removed one loose stone, then another. Behind them, hidden in darkness, cold steel reflected the lantern light. Not pipes, not bricks. A square steel hatch built into the mountain itself. Centered in its face rested an old military locking mechanism unlike anything made for an ordinary cabin. Jack stared at it for several silent seconds. Then he whispered the only words that made sense. This place was never just a house. Jack brushed years of gray dust from the square steel hatch until faded lettering emerged beneath his fingertips. Property of the United States Civil Defense Program. The paint had nearly vanished, but the letters had been stamped deep enough to survive decades beneath the mountain. Atlas stood beside him, his ears fixed on the hatch, not excited, alert, waiting. Jack examined the locking mechanism carefully. It wasn't built for ordinary keys. 4 steel tumblers surrounded a central cylinder, worn smooth by time but not by use. He recognized the design almost immediately. Military. Not exactly the same, but close enough to remind him of hardened communications vaults he had entered years earlier overseas. The memories arrived before he invited them. A steel blast door. The smell of hot generators. Radio operators shouting coordinates. Someone yelling, "Clear the room!" Jack blinked. The fireplace returned. His breathing steadied. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were a handful of lockpicks he hadn't touched since leaving the army. Back then they had opened supply lockers after damaged keys or broken mechanisms threatened missions. They weren't glamorous tools, just practical ones. He selected the narrowest pick and slowly worked it inside the mechanism. Atlas remained perfectly still. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tumblers resisted with stubborn precision. Whoever built this expected the lock to outlive its owner. Jack smiled faintly. So did the army. Another careful adjustment. A slight turn. One tumbler settled, then another. The final one gave way with a heavy metallic click that echoed deep inside the mountain. The hatch lifted only an inch before stopping under its own weight. Jack gripped both sides and strained, old knee protesting, shoulders tightening. Finally, the steel door swung upward. A rush of cool air rolled out of the darkness below. Not mold, not decay. Stone, old concrete, and diesel fuel. Atlas immediately stepped back. Not from fear, from discipline. He waited for permission. Jack retrieved the lantern from the table and lowered it into the opening. Concrete stairs disappeared into darkness. 30 feet, maybe more. The walls were poured reinforced concrete instead of carved stone. Engineered, purpose-built. He looked down the stairwell for nearly a full minute before taking the first step. One hand held the lantern. The other rested instinctively near his belt where a rifle had once hung. Halfway down, he stopped. Old habit. Listen first. Nothing. No dripping water. No rodents. Only silence. At the bottom, The narrow staircase opened into a concrete hallway stretching straight through the mountain. Metal conduit lined the ceiling. Dust covered the floor in an undisturbed blanket. Jack crouched. One set of footprints. His own. No others. Clear. The word slipped out quietly. Atlas padded forward beside him. The shepherd's nails clicked softly against the concrete before fading into silence. The first room they entered looked like a supply depot frozen in time. Steel shelving filled the walls, canvas medical bags, emergency blankets, crates stamped with federal inventory numbers. Everything organized, everything untouched. Another room held rows of hand-crank radios, field telephones, and boxed antennas. Each shelf carried handwritten inventory tags dated decades apart. Someone had maintained this place long after it was built. Jack continued deeper. The smell of diesel grew stronger. Ahead, a thick steel door stood partly open. Beyond it sat two enormous generators. Dust coated every surface, yet something caught his attention. The fuel lines, dry, but not cracked. Someone had preserved them correctly before sealing the station. Jack ran one hand across the nearest machine. The rough metal instantly pulled him somewhere else. Afghanistan. A forward operating base outside Kandahar. Generators humming through another sleepless night. Static over the headset. The sound of rotor blades approaching an LZ. His heart began pounding. Without thinking, he pivoted toward an empty corner, checking it before remembering there was no incoming convoy. No perimeter alarm. Only Atlas. The dog quietly pressed against Jack's leg, not forcing him, anchoring him. Jack closed his eyes for one slow breath. "I'm okay." Atlas accepted the answer. They moved on. The hallway curved sharply around solid bedrock before opening into a larger chamber. Maps covered one wall. Topographic surveys. River systems. Mountain roads. Emergency evacuation routes stretching across several Appalachian counties. Every map had tiny handwritten notes added in careful black ink. Beside them stood filing cabinets bolted to the concrete floor. Across the room rested an operations console, unlike anything Jack had ever seen outside military facilities. Rotary switches, analog gauges, heavy communication equipment. Dust lay everywhere except for one small rectangle near the center. Someone had wiped it clean. Long ago. Jack raised the lantern. An old monochrome monitor sat above the console. Its screen remained dark. He leaned closer. The moment his fingers brushed the metal frame, a faint electrical hum drifted through the room. Atlas immediately lifted his head. Somewhere beneath the concrete floor, unseen machinery answered with a slow vibration. The monitor flickered. Once, twice. Green light struggled across the ancient screen. Letters appeared one line at a time. Initializing. System check complete. Jack didn't move. Neither did Atlas. More text slowly appeared. Last authorized commander. Colonel Thomas Mercer. Jack stared without blinking. His father. The man who had disappeared from his life before Jack believed he was old enough to remember. The man he had spent 40 years convincing himself simply chose the army over his family. Atlas looked from the glowing monitor to Jack. The room remained perfectly silent, except for the low, steady hum, as though the mountain itself had just awakened. Jack stood frozen before the glowing monitor. His father's name remained on the screen, bright against the faded green display. Colonel Thomas Mercer. He read it once, then again. The letters refused to change. For a long moment, the only sound inside the underground station was the quiet pulse of old electronics finding life after decades of silence. Atlas walked to Jack's side and sat close enough that their shoulders touched. Jack reached out without looking, resting his hand on the dog's neck. His fingers trembled. "You're dead," he whispered to the empty room. "You've been dead a long time." The monitor flickered once more. A small compartment beneath the console clicked open by itself. Inside rested a leather journal, a reel-to-reel recording tape sealed inside a plastic case, and a brass key attached to a faded military tag. The tag carried a single handwritten note. For Jack. He stared at those two words far longer than he intended. No one had written his name by hand in years. He picked up the journal first. The leather was cracked from age, but someone had cared for it. There wasn't a trace of mold, despite the decades hidden beneath the mountain. When he opened the cover, the familiar handwriting stopped him cold. He hadn't seen it since childhood. His father's block letters had always leaned slightly to the right. Steady, orderly. Every line looked like it belonged on an engineering blueprint. The first page contained only one sentence. "If you're reading this, then you found the station without anyone leading you here." Jack slowly lowered himself into the old command chair. Atlas lay beside his boots. Outside the station, the mountain remained perfectly still. He turned the page. The journal did not begin with engineering diagrams or military reports. It began with an apology. "Jack, if you spent your life believing I chose the army over you, then I failed twice." His vision blurred. He rubbed a rough hand across his face before continuing. "The easiest thing would have been to come home and tell you everything. The hardest thing is knowing I never could." Jack swallowed hard. As a boy, he had waited beside the living room window every birthday, every Christmas, every summer. His mother always found another excuse. "Your father's serving somewhere important. He couldn't get leave. Maybe next year." Eventually, the excuses stopped. The waiting stopped too. He closed the journal. For several quiet seconds, he simply listened to the humming station. A memory surfaced without warning. He was 8 years old, standing beside the mailbox, watching another military sedan drive away after delivering papers his mother never let him read. He remembered asking one question. "Did Dad send anything?" She answered without looking at him. "No." For 40 years, he believed her. Atlas nudged the journal gently with his nose. Jack let out a slow breath and opened it again. Several pages later, the writing changed from personal reflections to carefully dated entries. Thomas Mercer described coordinating emergency supply routes through isolated mountain communities after devastating floods, blizzards, and mine collapses. The station beneath the cabin wasn't built as a bunker against war. It had been built to save forgotten towns when every road disappeared beneath snow or landslides. Maps, radio networks, hidden fuel reserves, emergency food caches, everything connected. Everything designed to keep people alive when no one else could reach them. Jack looked around the enormous underground room with new eyes. It had never been a secret fortress. It had been a lifeline. The journal continued. "There are people who believe emergency funds exist to be divided. I believed they existed to protect families no one else remembered. That disagreement made powerful enemies." Atlas suddenly lifted his head, not alarmed, listening. Somewhere deeper inside the station, another relay clicked softly. The old tape recorder beside the journal came alive with a faint mechanical whir. The reels began turning. Static filled the room. Then a calm voice emerged. Older, tired, but unmistakable. "Jack." The single word emptied the air from his lungs. "I don't know how old you'll be when you hear this. I only know I'll already be gone." Jack stared at the spinning reels. His father's voice carried the same quiet confidence he barely remembered from childhood. "If you're angry with me..." A long pause. "You earned that." Another pause. but don't waste your life hating a man who never stopped loving his son. Jack lowered his head. His knuckles turned white around the edge of the chair. Atlas rested his chin across Jack's boot. The tape continued. I accepted disgrace because exposing the truth too early would have buried every piece of evidence with me. I couldn't protect both my family and the people depending on this station. I prayed one day you would understand why. Silence followed. Only the soft turning of the reels remained. Jack finally looked back into the journal. Near the bottom of the final page rested one sentence written in darker ink than all the others. The words had been underlined twice. Never trust Hale. Jack frowned. There was no explanation, no first name, no rank. Only that warning. He repeated it quietly to himself. Hale. The name meant nothing. Not yet. But somewhere inside the mountain, another unseen relay clicked as if the station itself had been waiting for him to read those words. Jack stared at the journal for another minute before closing it with both hands. The mountain seemed quieter now, not empty, patient. Atlas rose without being told and walked deeper into the operations room. His nose drifted along rows of filing cabinets bolted to the concrete floor. He paused at one cabinet, sniffed twice, then looked back over his shoulder. Jack followed. The cabinet doors were secured by a simple brass latch instead of a lock. When he pulled them open, folders filled every shelf from top to bottom. Each carried a typed label and a handwritten date. Flood response, bridge inspection, emergency fuel allocation, winter relief, mountain access roads. The files stretched back decades. Jack removed one at random. Inside were engineering reports, inspection photographs, invoices, and handwritten notes signed by Colonel Thomas Mercer. Every page was organized with military precision. Nothing about the station had been improvised. Someone had spent a lifetime building it. Atlas moved again, this time toward a waist-high steel safe tucked beneath a drafting table. He sniffed the handle once, then gently touched it with one paw. Jack knelt beside the safe. Unlike the heavy blast doors, this lock was ordinary. The brass key from the console fit perfectly. The tumblers turned with a satisfying click. Inside lay 3 thick binders, several reels of microfilm, and a sealed envelope marked Financial Archive, for authorized command only. Jack opened the first binder. His expression changed almost immediately. Columns of figures filled every page: federal appropriations, project numbers, construction contracts, emergency disaster funding. At first they looked like ordinary government records. Then patterns began to appear. The same contractor's name surfaced again and again. Hale Resource Group, different projects, different counties, different years, always the same company. Jack turned another page. Millions of dollars allocated for mountain rescue roads. Status: completed. He frowned. The road leading to the cabin had nearly disappeared beneath decades of neglect. Another page. Avalanche shelter construction. Status: operational. Jack had driven through 3 mountain towns without seeing a single shelter. Another. Emergency housing for displaced veterans. Status: fully funded. He remembered sleeping inside his truck while snow piled against the doors. His jaw tightened. He kept reading. Every binder told the same story. Money approved, money released, projects declared complete. Yet outside these mountains, almost none of them existed. Atlas quietly settled beside him while Jack spread documents across the concrete floor. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Year after year, administration after administration, funds disappeared into contracts that produced almost nothing. Near the bottom of the final ledger, Colonel Mercer had written a note in black ink. Estimated diverted federal emergency funds: $298,417,233. Beneath it, another handwritten sentence. By the time someone reads this, it will almost certainly exceed 300 million. Jack leaned back against the filing cabinet. $300 million. Not stolen from banks. Not stolen from investors. Taken from mountain communities. From rescue teams. From families waiting for washed-out roads to reopen. From veterans promised places to rebuild their lives. He slowly closed the binder. So that's what you died protecting. Atlas lifted his head. Footsteps. No. Not footsteps. A vehicle. Very faint. Somewhere down in the valley. Jack switched off the lantern. The underground station fell into darkness except for the soft green glow of the old monitor. He listened. Engine noise. One vehicle. Not climbing toward the cabin, passing below. He waited until it faded. Old habits. Never assume, never rush. Satisfied, he lit the lantern again. Inside the envelope marked Financial Archive was a single photograph. 5 men stood smiling beside a ribbon-cutting ceremony in front of an unfinished emergency operations building. Everyone wore hard hats except one man. He stood in an expensive suit, silver hair, confident smile, hand extended toward the cameras. Across the bottom, someone had written, Victor Hale, Groundbreaking Ceremony, Appalachian Emergency Preparedness Initiative. Jack turned the picture over. His father's handwriting covered the back. He'll convince the world he's saving these mountains. Look at what he builds, not what he promises. Jack folded the photograph carefully and slipped it inside his shirt pocket. For the first time since opening the station, the warning in his father's journal had a face. Hale. The name no longer felt empty. Atlas suddenly stood, his ears pointed toward the ceiling, not the hallway, above them, toward the cabin. Jack immediately lowered the lantern. The shepherd wasn't barking. He was listening. A second later came the unmistakable crunch of gravel beneath slow-moving tires. Someone had driven onto the mountain road. Someone who hadn't been there when Jack came down into the station. Jack instinctively reached for the old field flashlight clipped to his belt. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. Every movement became deliberate. Without another word, he and Atlas started toward the staircase. Neither of them noticed the pair of binoculars watching the cabin from the tree line hundreds of yards away, before disappearing silently into the forest. Jack eased the steel hatch closed behind him until it settled into place with a dull thud beneath the fireplace. Stone after stone went back exactly where Atlas had first found them. By the time they stepped outside, nothing suggested an underground station lay hidden beneath the cabin. The evening air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. Atlas paused on the porch, nose lifted into the breeze. His ears twitched once toward the lower road. Jack followed his gaze. A white pickup sat nearly half a mile below, parked beside the old logging trail. The engine was off. Sunlight flashed across the windshield, then disappeared. Too far away to identify. Close enough to matter. Jack didn't wave. He simply watched. 5 minutes later, the truck rolled away. No one came to the cabin. No one knocked. That bothered him more than if they had. The following morning, he walked the property before breakfast. Not because he planned to, because his feet carried him that way. Years earlier, every morning had begun the same way inside a forward operating base. Check the perimeter, read the ground, look for what changed overnight. Atlas ranged ahead in slow circles, never losing sight of him. Jack noticed the first sign near the eastern fence line. Fresh tire tracks, different tread pattern than his pickup. The mud inside the grooves was still damp. Someone had driven there after midnight. He crouched beside them, touching the edge lightly. Not county maintenance, not an ATV, a heavy SUV. He stood without saying a word. 200 yards farther uphill, Atlas stopped beside a broken pine branch hanging chest high. The break was clean, recent, not storm damage. Someone had pushed through the brush without wanting to leave the trail. Jack's eyes moved automatically. High ground, escape routes, dead ground. Observation points. He hadn't thought this way in years. Now it came back as naturally as breathing. Atlas gave a soft huff and continued climbing. The ridge above the cabin flattened into a narrow shelf, hidden behind thick stands of oak and hemlock. From there, Jack could see everything. The front porch, the logging road, the creek crossing, even the switchback leading toward town. Yet from below, the overlook was almost invisible. He slowly smiled, a natural OP. He hadn't used the term observation post since Afghanistan. Atlas wagged his tail once, as if approving the discovery. Jack spent the next 2 hours improving it, without cutting a single living tree. He stacked loose rocks into a low seat, dragged fallen branches into natural camouflage, marked 2 quiet withdrawal routes back toward the cabin, using broken twigs that only he would recognize. No flags, no tape, nothing obvious. Old habits left little behind. That afternoon, another vehicle arrived. This one climbed all the way to the porch. A county utility truck. A man wearing a reflective vest climbed out carrying a clipboard. "Afternoon," he called pleasantly. "Just checking abandoned structures for electrical hazards." Jack looked at the cabin. "There isn't any electricity." The man smiled. "Mind if I take a quick look anyway?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the man's boots. Brand new. Almost no mud despite the rough road. The truck carried a utility logo. The tires didn't. Different manufacturer. Recently changed. Little things. Things most people ignored. "I'm still moving in," Jack finally replied. "Maybe another day." The man's smile held for another second, before fading almost imperceptibly. "No problem." He climbed back inside the truck and drove away. He never looked at the roof, never looked at the chimney, never looked at the electrical meter. Only at the front windows, as though hoping to see something inside. The next morning brought a different visitor. A lawyer. At least that was what his business card claimed. He introduced himself politely, explaining that several nearby property owners had concerns about old mineral rights beneath the mountain. "We're mostly interested in what's under the land," he said casually. Jack folded the card into his pocket. "So nobody's interested in the cabin?" The attorney hesitated. "Well," Jack answered for him. Funny, by the time the man drove away, Atlas was already sniffing around the gravel turnout. He stopped beside a cigarette butt. Fresh. Still carrying the faint smell of smoke. Jack picked it up using a leaf. The brand wasn't common around these parts. Neither was expensive cologne. He dropped both into an empty coffee can inside the truck. Evidence. Maybe useless. Maybe not. Late that afternoon, another vehicle climbed the mountain. This time it carried the county sheriff's markings. "Deputy," not the sheriff himself. The deputy remained friendly enough. "Just checking on a report of trespassing." Jack nodded toward the empty woods. "You find anyone?" The deputy glanced toward the cabin. "Basement?" Jack's expression never changed. "No basement." The deputy stared at him for one long second, then smiled politely. "Have a good evening." Jack watched the cruiser disappear through the trees. Only after the dust settled did he quietly speak. They all ask about everything. He looked toward the hidden fireplace inside the cabin, except the house. Atlas suddenly stiffened. The dog's head snapped toward the ridgeline above the cabin. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Jack followed his gaze just as a sharp crack split the evening air. Glass exploded across the kitchen floor. The cabin window shattered inward. The sound wasn't loud. It was smaller than an ordinary rifle. Suppressed. Someone had fired from the trees. Atlas barked once. Jack was already moving. He dropped instinctively behind the stone foundation before his mind had fully caught up with his body. Years disappeared. The mountain cabin became an Afghan compound. The shattered window became incoming contact. His heartbeat accelerated with frightening familiarity. Left sector, he whispered automatically. Then he stopped himself. No squad. No radio. Only Atlas. The German shepherd stayed low beside the porch instead of charging into the woods. His eyes remained fixed on the ridgeline where the shot had come from. Whoever fired knew what they were doing. One round. No follow-up. Testing. Watching. Jack waited almost 2 full minutes before moving again. Patience had kept more soldiers alive than speed ever had. He circled behind the cabin instead of stepping through the broken doorway. Atlas mirrored every movement without command. The forest had fallen silent. Even the birds had stopped. That bothered Jack more than the broken glass. Late afternoon slowly gave way to evening, and with darkness came freezing rain that turned patches of old snow into slick sheets of ice. Jack knew the shooter could still be nearby, or already gone. The uncertainty was worse. He climbed quietly toward the observation point Atlas had discovered the day before. Each step landed carefully along exposed rock instead of dead leaves. No unnecessary noise, no straight lines. Halfway up the ridge, Atlas suddenly froze, not looking ahead. Looking behind, Jack turned. Nothing. Just pine trunks disappearing into the gathering fog. Then Atlas lunged, hard. The force slammed into Jack's hip just as another muted crack echoed across the mountainside. Something hot tore through the air where his chest had been. The impact spun Atlas sideways. The dog hit the frozen ground with a sharp cry. For one terrible second, everything stopped. Atlas! Jack dropped beside him. Dark blood spread quickly through the shepherd's tan fur near his left shoulder. The round had grazed across the muscle instead of striking center mass. Lucky, painful, but survivable. Another shot never came. Jack scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved. The shooter had already withdrawn. Professional. Hit or miss. Never linger. Jack slid one arm beneath Atlas's chest. The shepherd tried to stand. Couldn't. It's okay, buddy. Atlas looked up, breathing hard but never whining again. Jack lifted all 80 pounds of him into his arms. His damaged knee protested immediately. He ignored it. Rain soaked both of them before they reached the cabin. Inside, shattered glass covered the kitchen floor. Jack carried Atlas straight into the living room and cleared space beside the fireplace. His old military medical kit still sat beneath the truck seat where it had lived for years. He fetched it without thinking. Vacuum-sealed dressings, compression bandages, trauma shears, expired, still usable. His hands moved with practiced precision. Cut away the fur, flush the wound, direct pressure, check for an exit. None. Good. The bullet had carved a deep groove without entering the shoulder. Atlas flinched only once. Jack wrapped the bandage snugly before checking circulation below the injury. Strong pulse, warm paw. Good. Only then did he realize he had been talking the entire time. Quietly, almost unconsciously. Stay with me. He paused. The words hung in the room. Years earlier, he had repeated that sentence over wounded soldiers lying in Afghan dust. Some answered, some never did. Now he found himself saying it to the only partner still beside him. Atlas lifted his head weakly and licked Jack's wrist. Jack laughed once. A tired, broken sound. I know. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the roof. Inside, the fire slowly chased the cold away. Hours passed. Atlas finally drifted into exhausted sleep. Jack refused to. He sat with his back against the wall, flashlight across his lap, eyes drifting toward every sound the wind carried through the trees. Near midnight, he remembered something from the station below. The old medical cabinet. There had been supplies stored underground. Maybe antibiotics. Maybe something better than what remained in his aging field kit. He waited until Atlas was sleeping comfortably before moving the stones from the fireplace once more. Lantern in hand, Jack descended alone. The underground station greeted him with the same steady hum. He walked directly toward the medical storage room. Metal shelves lined one wall. Most supplies had expired decades earlier. Bandages, splints, surgical instruments preserved inside sealed containers. As he searched the cabinets, one drawer refused to open completely. Something blocked it from behind. Jack pulled harder. The drawer shifted another inch, enough to reveal a hidden latch mounted inside the cabinet wall. He pressed it. A narrow compartment silently slid outward. Inside rested 3 rugged military data drives sealed inside waterproof cases. Each carried the same handwritten label. Project Sentinel. Authorized access only. Beneath them lay a folded note in Colonel Mercer's familiar handwriting. If someone has tried to kill you, you're finally looking in the right place. Jack stared at the message. Far above, the wind rattled the cabin windows. Beside the fireplace, Atlas slept through the pain, unaware that the real secret hidden beneath the mountain had only just begun to reveal itself. Jack carried the 3 waterproof drives into the operations room and placed them carefully beside Colonel Mercer's journal. The labels were simple. Project Sentinel. No dates, no explanations. Only those 2 words. The old command console still glowed faintly, powered by whatever hidden generators continued humming beneath the mountain after all these years. Jack studied the drives without touching them. His father had left instructions for almost everything. Not this. He opened the journal again. Several pages near the back had been folded over. The first line immediately caught his eye. If Sentinel has been opened, the paper records are no longer enough. He kept reading. The underground station had never served only as an emergency logistics center. Every contract approved, every inspection signed, every federal transfer routed through the regional emergency network had automatically generated encrypted backup records, invisible copies, stored independently, untouchable. Thomas Mercer had designed the system after discovering that physical documents could disappear far too easily. Governments changed. Officials retired. Buildings burned. Paper vanished. Digital truth, properly hidden, endured. Jack slid the first drive into an aging reader built into the console. Nothing happened. Then the monitor awakened. Authorized access required. He reached for the brass key his father had left. The key fit a hidden slot beneath the screen. A soft mechanical click echoed through the room. The display changed. Project Sentinel Archive Available Federal Infrastructure Records, 1987 to 2021. Jack's eyes narrowed. His father had died years before the 2021. How had the archive continued? Another page opened automatically. Remote synchronization active. The station had never stopped collecting information. Someone had built a machine capable of quietly recording decades of corruption without anyone realizing it existed. Folders appeared one after another. Emergency housing, wildfire mitigation, bridge reconstruction, flood response, veterans assistance. Every project tied back to Hale Resource Group. Jack opened one contract. then another. Each included signatures, approvals, bank transfers, satellite photographs, construction reports. Many of the photographs showed empty fields where completed emergency facilities were supposedly standing. The fraud wasn't merely financial. Entire communities had been promised protection that never existed. A soft groan escaped him. So this is what 300 million bought. Atlas stirred upstairs but remained asleep. Jack continued searching. Near the bottom of the archive sat another folder. Active surveillance. He opened it. His heartbeat slowed. Not faster, slower. The feeling every soldier recognized before something dangerous. Inside were maintenance logs documenting repeated attempts to locate the underground station. Unknown survey crews, unauthorized drilling permits, private geological studies. Each entry carried one recurring name: Victor Hale, for over 20 years. He hadn't stumbled into the station. He had hunted it. Footstep by footstep, permit by permit, lawsuit by lawsuit. Jack leaned back. The attack on the cabin no longer felt random. Someone had been waiting for whoever opened this place. A voice interrupted the silence. "Looks like you found the truth." Jack spun. Daniel Cross stood quietly in the entrance to the operations room, holding both hands where they could be seen. He was nearly 70, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing an old Army Corps jacket faded by decades of field work. Atlas hadn't barked, which meant Daniel had entered the cabin long before coming downstairs. Jack kept his distance. "You picked a bad way to introduce yourself." Daniel nodded. "I know. My name won't mean much. It should. I worked beside Colonel Mercer." The room fell silent again. Jack searched the older man's face. No polished shoes, no expensive watch. Mud still clung to his work boots. He looked like someone who had actually walked the mountain. "I came after hearing someone bought the cabin." Daniel's eyes drifted across the glowing monitor. "I prayed it wasn't Hale." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he asked the question soldiers always asked first. "Who else knows you're here?" "No one." "You followed me?" "I followed the smoke from your chimney." Jack watched him another long moment. Years of military instinct searched for deception. Daniel simply waited. Finally, Jack stepped aside. Daniel approached the monitor slowly. When he saw the Sentinel archive, the color drained from his face. "My God. So it survived. You knew about this?" "I knew your father was building insurance. I never knew how much." Daniel gently rested one weathered hand against the console. "He once told me, paper burns. Machines remember." Jack studied him carefully. "If you knew my father, then tell me something only he would have said." Daniel smiled faintly. Whenever an engineer rushed a bridge inspection, he'd say, "Concrete always wins the argument." Jack looked down. That sentence. He hadn't heard it since he was 10 years old. His father used to repeat it whenever Jack tried cutting corners building tree forts behind the house. For the first time since entering the station, Jack believed someone besides himself still carried pieces of Colonel Thomas Mercer. Daniel's expression slowly darkened. "He'll come himself now." "Who?" "Hale. He never trusted employees with unfinished business," almost as if summoned by the words. An engine echoed faintly through the mountain. Not one vehicle, several. Jack walked quietly toward the security monitor connected to the old observation cameras. The grainy black and white image flickered alive. 3 dark SUVs were climbing the logging road. The lead vehicle stopped below the cabin. A tall, silver-haired man stepped out. Even through the poor resolution, Jack recognized the face from the photograph inside his pocket. Victor Hale had finally come to the mountain. The grainy security monitor showed Hale stepping from the lead SUV with the confidence of a man who had never expected to hear the word no. He wasn't wearing hiking boots. He wasn't dressed for the mountains. His polished leather shoes sank slightly into the muddy road, yet he never looked down. Two men remained near the vehicles. Another walked several yards behind him, speaking quietly into a handheld radio. Jack studied the screen. No rifles showing. Daniel Cross stood beside him. That doesn't mean they aren't carrying. Jack nodded. They're here to talk first, because they think they still have leverage. Upstairs, Atlas gave a low bark, not loud. One short warning. Jack climbed back through the hidden hatch. The cabin had grown darker beneath heavy clouds gathering over the ridge. Atlas was standing beside the broken window. His injured shoulder trembled slightly beneath the bandage, but he refused to lie down. You should be resting. Atlas ignored him. Instead, he limped toward the far side of the living room, not toward the fireplace, toward the old communications wall beside the staircase. He sniffed once, twice, then scratched gently at the weathered pine boards. Jack frowned. You already found one secret. The shepherd scratched again, not excited, certain. Jack retrieved a pry bar from the truck. The first board came loose easily. Behind it was only rough stone. The second revealed old electrical conduit. The third refused to move until Jack leaned his full weight against it. With a dry crack, the board swung outward. Cold air drifted from the narrow cavity hidden inside the wall. Atlas immediately stepped back. Jack raised his flashlight. A steel cabinet stood inside the recess. No electronic keypad, no combination dial, only two thick mechanical deadbolts. Old-fashioned, reliable. Daniel knelt beside it. I've seen these before. Army? No. Corps engineers. They used them where electricity couldn't be trusted. Jack examined the lock. No sign of tampering, no scratches. Whatever waited inside had never been opened after it was sealed. The brass key from the console did not fit. Neither did the key from the safe. Daniel smiled faintly. Look closer. Jack did. Tiny numbers had been stamped beneath each deadbolt. 1, 9, 7, 1. His pulse slowed. 1971. The year the station was completed. He rotated the bolts in sequence. The cabinet released with a deep metallic click. Inside rested a compact satellite transmitter no larger than an old suitcase. Beside it sat another waterproof archive case, smaller than the Sentinel drives, heavier. On top lay a cassette recorder and one final envelope. Jack unfolded the note. His father's handwriting appeared immediately. If Atlas found this... Jack stopped. His eyes drifted toward the German shepherd. The old dog sat quietly, despite the pain in his shoulder, almost as though he had been carrying out one last search assignment. Jack continued reading. Then trust the dog before you trust any man. A smile crossed Daniel's face. Sounds like Thomas. Jack pressed play on the recorder. Static filled the room. Then Colonel Mercer's calm voice emerged once again. Son, if you've reached this cabinet, then Sentinel wasn't enough. I always assumed someone powerful would eventually discover the station, so I built one more layer. Jack glanced toward the satellite equipment. His father continued. The drives inside contain complete engineering records, financial evidence, authorization logs, and automatic transmission software. They were never meant to stand here forever. They were built to leave. Daniel stared at the transmitter. My God, it still works? It was designed to. The recording continued. When connected to the operations console below, the archive will authenticate through my command authorization. It will then send every record simultaneously to multiple federal investigators, independent auditors, and journalists I spent years quietly identifying. Jack looked toward the mountain outside. Years. His father had planned this for years. You don't need permission. You don't need politicians. You only need enough time. The tape clicked softly before the final sentence. And if anyone tells you there's another way, they're already working for him. Silence returned. No one spoke. Outside, tires crunched across wet gravel. A vehicle door closed. Then another. Victor Hale had reached the porch. 3 slow knocks echoed through the cabin. Not angry. Not hurried. The knock of someone completely certain the conversation would end in his favor. Jack slid the archive case into his backpack. Daniel quietly lifted the satellite transmitter. Atlas struggled to his feet. Despite the bandaged shoulder, he positioned himself between Jack and the front door. The old soldier rested one hand gently on the dog's neck. I know. The knocking came again. Then a calm voice carried through the wood. Mr. Mercer, my name is Victor Hale. I believe we're both reasonable men. I'd like to discuss what belongs to each of us. Jack looked toward the hidden fireplace, then toward the backpack containing the final contingency his father had built. He already knew one thing. Nothing inside that pack belonged to Victor Hale. Jack gave Atlas one quiet nod before walking toward the front door. The German Shepherd remained beside the fireplace, body angled toward the entrance despite the fresh bandage around his shoulder. Pain had slowed him. It had not changed him. Jack unlocked the door but kept one hand resting against it. When he pulled it open, Victor Hale stood alone on the porch. Rain drifted through the pines behind him. The 3 SUVs remained parked farther down the logging road, close enough to arrive quickly, far enough to appear polite. Hale offered a practiced smile. Mr. Mercer. Jack. I appreciate you speaking with me. Jack said nothing. For several seconds, only the wind moved between them. Hale looked older up close than he had in the photographs. Not weaker. Simply worn. His silver hair clung damply to his forehead, and his expensive jacket carried tiny drops of mountain rain that looked strangely out of place in the wilderness. You've found something important, Hale said calmly. I've found my father's house. A great deal more than that. Jack studied him. You already know what's underneath. Hale didn't deny it. I've known about this mountain for nearly 25 years, but I never found the entrance. Jack folded his arms. So now you're asking. I'm offering. Hale slowly removed a folded document from inside his coat. A transfer agreement. You retain ownership of the cabin. My foundation assumes responsibility for everything below it. You'll receive enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Jack never reached for the paper. How much? Hale named a number. It was enough to buy a ranch, enough to erase every unpaid bill, enough to make homelessness feel like a bad memory. Jack remembered sleeping inside his truck during winter. He remembered counting $47 before the county auction. For one brief moment, the offer sounded almost reasonable. Then he remembered the ledgers. $300 million that had belonged to mountain towns, emergency shelters that had never been built, veterans who had slept in trucks just like his. You've rehearsed this speech, Jack said quietly. For years. Hale's smile faded. I've had time. Jack nodded once. So did my father. Silence settled again. Finally, Hale sighed. I don't enjoy conflict. No. I've spent decades building relationships. People trust me. They should. Jack looked toward the valley below. They trusted you with emergency funds. Hale didn't answer. Instead, he spoke more softly. You've served your country. So did your father. You understand sacrifice. I do. Then understand this. Sometimes good people must compromise to protect larger systems. Jack almost laughed. I heard speeches like that overseas. They always ended with somebody else paying the price. Hale studied him for a long moment. When he spoke again, the warmth had disappeared from his voice. The station cannot remain active. It already is. You don't understand what happens if those records leave this mountain. I understand exactly. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. So you found Sentinel. Jack gave nothing away. Behind him, Daniel Cross quietly descended into the hidden station carrying the satellite transmitter. Atlas watched every movement without making a sound. Jack had already decided. The conversation above ground was never meant to change Hale's mind. It was buying time, exactly the way Colonel Mercer had planned. Several minutes later, Hale glanced toward his watch. I assume you've made your decision. I have. And? Jack stepped back. I'm keeping the house. He gently closed the door. No slam. No anger. Just finality. Outside, Hale remained motionless for several seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the waiting SUVs. Jack immediately crossed to the fireplace. The hidden hatch opened. Daniel was already connecting the satellite transmitter to the operations console. The old monitor brightened. A new prompt appeared. Secondary archive detected. Authorization required. Jack inserted the brass key. The machine hummed. One relay after another awakened beneath the mountain. Atlas slowly limped downstairs despite Jack's protest. The shepherd refused to remain behind. The monitor flashed. Authorization accepted. Initiating Federal Transmission Protocol. A progress bar appeared. 1%. Then 2. Daniel looked toward Jack. Once it starts, it can't be stopped. So my father wrote. Above them, engines roared to life. The SUVs were moving. Not leaving. Coming closer. Heavy boots pounded across the porch. Voices echoed outside. Someone struck the front door hard enough to shake the cabin. Atlas growled. Jack remained focused on the screen. 10%. 15. Another crash rattled the cabin. Wood splintered somewhere upstairs. Daniel looked toward the staircase. They're coming. Jack calmly lifted the lantern. No. They're arriving. He already knew every approach to the cabin, every rock wall, every narrow trail, every place an unfamiliar man would lose precious seconds. Years ago, those instincts had kept soldiers alive. Tonight, they only needed to keep the mountain breathing a little longer. The progress bar reached 24%. Outside, Sheriff Owen Briggs stepped from his cruiser at the edge of the clearing. He stared at Victor Hale, then at the armed contractors surrounding the cabin. Something about the scene made him stop walking. For the first time, he looked less like a lawman following orders, and more like a man beginning to question who had been giving them. Sheriff Owen Briggs stood in the cold rain without moving. The contractors looked toward him, waiting. Victor Hale did not. His attention remained fixed on the cabin, on the mountain, on whatever still lived beneath it. Another heavy blow struck the front door. The old frame groaned but held. Down inside the station, Jack watched the progress bar continue its slow climb. 32%. 38. The satellite transmitter emitted a steady pulse, its small indicator light blinking with quiet determination. Daniel Cross checked the cable connections one final time. It won't fail, he said. It was built for worse. Jack nodded. So was my father. Atlas lay beside the console, breathing steadily despite the bandage wrapped around his shoulder. Every few moments, he lifted his head toward the staircase, listening, then settled again. Even injured, he never stopped guarding. A loud voice echoed from above. "Jack Mercer." It was Sheriff Briggs. "I need to speak with you." Jack looked at Daniel. "I'll be back." He climbed the narrow stairs alone. When he stepped into the cabin, rain had begun blowing through the broken kitchen window. Briggs stood several yards from the porch. His hands were empty. Victor Hale waited behind him beneath a black umbrella. The contractors remained farther back. Briggs removed his hat. "I've got federal agents on the phone." Jack said nothing. "They're asking questions nobody's asked in 20 years. He glanced toward Hale. "They already have copies of contracts, bank records, engineering reports." His eyes returned to Jack. "Did you send them?" Jack answered honestly. "My father did." Briggs stared for a long moment. Then something inside him finally settled. "I spent 15 years believing I was protecting this county." His voice had grown quieter. "Now I'm wondering who I was really protecting." Behind him, Hale spoke for the first time. "It's not too late." Nobody answered. The sheriff slowly turned toward the older businessman. "I've known you half my career. You sponsored my department. You paid for rescue equipment. You shook every hand in this county." He paused. "And somehow, every emergency project still ran out of money." Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. "I should have seen it." Hale's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. "You saw what everyone else saw, what I wanted you to see." No one spoke after that. The silence said enough. Far below, sirens echoed faintly from the highway. Not local. Different. State vehicles. Federal vehicles. Coming fast. Back inside the station, the transmission reached 79%. Daniel smiled for the first time. They made it through the first relay. Jack returned downstairs. Atlas struggled to his feet and limped toward him. Jack scratched gently behind the dog's ears. "You did good." The shepherd leaned against his leg, not asking for praise, simply making sure his partner was still standing. 91%. The old machinery hummed more deeply now, as though the mountain itself understood something final was approaching. A new message appeared on the monitor. Transmission verified. Multiple recipients confirmed. Daniel exhaled slowly. They're receiving everything. 97. 98. Jack found himself thinking not about Victor Hale, but about his father. A man who had accepted disgrace, who had watched people misunderstand him, who had carried the truth alone because he believed someday someone else would finish the mission. The screen flashed. 100%. The station fell silent for one long heartbeat. Then another message appeared. Archive delivered. Federal verification complete. System entering permanent autonomous mode. Without warning, heavy mechanisms shifted somewhere deep beneath the mountain. Not violent. Massive. Stone answered steel. Steel answered stone. Levers inside the console locked themselves into place. Indicator lights faded one by one. The monitor slowly darkened. The satellite transmitter powered down. Its work finished forever. Daniel rested one hand on the console. No one controls it now. Jack looked across the quiet room. No one ever should have. Above them came the unmistakable sound of vehicles arriving in force. Doors opening, voices identifying themselves. Someone calling for Victor Hale by name. Atlas lifted his head toward the ceiling. For the first time since they had climbed this mountain, he did not growl. He simply listened. Outside, federal investigators began taking control of the property. Victor Hale offered no resistance. He stood quietly beside Sheriff Briggs, watching the mountains one last time before placing his hands behind his back. The rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and spread slowly across the ridges. Hours later, news spread through every town in eastern Kentucky. Federal investigators had uncovered decades of fraud tied to emergency preparedness projects throughout Appalachia. Frozen accounts, seized companies, recovered assets. The estimated total approached $300 million. Money that would finally return to the communities it had been taken from. Jack never asked how much any of it was worth. He only climbed the hill outside the cabin with Atlas beside him. Together, they looked across the valley. Far below, repair crews had already begun inspecting the washed-out mountain road that had sat abandoned for years, for the first time since buying the locked cabin. Jack looked at the mountains, and they no longer felt like a place where he had come to disappear. They felt like home. Winter arrived slowly across the eastern Kentucky mountains. The first snow settled quietly over the pines, softening the scars left by broken branches, tire tracks, and weeks of uncertainty. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. Fresh smoke curled from its chimney every morning. The shattered window had been repaired. The old porch had been rebuilt using timber cut from fallen oak instead of living trees. Jack worked without hurry. One board, one nail, one day at a time. Atlas stayed close through every job. His shoulder healed well, though a slight limp remained whenever the mornings turned especially cold. Jack noticed it every time. Atlas never seemed to care. Word spread through the mountain towns faster than Jack expected. Not about the hidden station. That remained under federal protection. People talked instead about the old veteran living in the forgotten cabin who always kept coffee hot during snowstorms. The first visitors arrived after an unexpected blizzard stranded 2 hikers on the logging road. Jack found them before sunrise. One had twisted an ankle. The other had nearly exhausted his phone battery searching for help. Without asking questions, Jack led them inside. The fire was already burning. Atlas greeted them with one slow wag of his tail before lying beside the stove. 3 weeks later, a volunteer firefighter knocked on the door carrying a handwritten sign. "Emergency shelter. You ought to hang this outside." Jack looked at the sign for a long moment. Then he nodded. By Christmas, the cabin had quietly become something its builders would have recognized. A place where strangers could arrive cold and leave warm. One afternoon, Margaret Ellis drove up the mountain carrying 2 cardboard boxes overflowing with donated blankets and books from the town library. She smiled when she saw children reading beside the fireplace. "I think Colonel Mercer would have approved." Jack looked toward the stone hearth. "So do I." Not long after New Year's, another envelope arrived. No government seal, no lawyer's letterhead, only his name written carefully across the front. Jack recognized the handwriting immediately. Emily. His daughter. He hadn't spoken to her in nearly 9 years. He carried the unopened letter outside before finally breaking the seal. The words inside were simple. "Dad, I saw your name in the news, not because of the money, because people kept saying you stayed. You helped strangers. I thought maybe, if you're willing, I'd like my son to meet his grandfather." Jack read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. He didn't cry. Instead, he stared across the valley until the afternoon sun disappeared behind the ridges. Several weeks later, an old pickup climbed the mountain road. A little boy stepped out before the engine had fully stopped. He couldn't have been older than 7. He noticed Atlas first. "Can I pet him?" Jack looked at the shepherd. Atlas walked forward on his own. The boy wrapped both arms around the old dog's neck. Atlas leaned gently against him, careful of his healing shoulder. Emily stood nearby, uncertain. Neither she nor Jack seemed to know how to begin, so neither tried. Instead, Jack picked up an axe. "Ever split firewood?" The boy grinned. "No, sir." "Good. Today's your first lesson." The afternoon passed beneath quiet conversation, the steady rhythm of splitting logs, and the smell of fresh pine drifting through cold mountain air. No dramatic speeches, no apologies rehearsed for years, only shared work. Sometimes that was enough. That evening, after everyone had gone inside, Jack walked down to the hidden station one last time. The console remained dark. The machinery no longer accepted commands. Deep beneath the mountain, water systems, emergency communications, and protected infrastructure continued operating exactly as Colonel Mercer intended, without politics, without greed, without anyone claiming ownership. Jack placed his father's journal on the command desk. Beside it rested the worn brass key. Their work was finished. When he climbed back into the cabin, Atlas was already asleep beside the fireplace. The old shepherd opened one eye as Jack entered. Satisfied everything was normal, he rested his head again. The wind rattled softly against the windows. Months earlier, that sound would have thrown Jack from sleep before he understood where he was. Tonight, he simply pulled another log onto the fire. Outside, snow continued falling across the mountains. Inside, warmth settled into every corner of the old cabin. Jack stretched out beneath a thick wool blanket. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he closed his eyes without checking every door, without searching every shadow, without reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The fire crackled. Atlas sighed quietly in his sleep. Morning would bring more travelers, more veterans, more neighbors needing a warm place to stop. That was enough, because Colonel Thomas Mercer had been right all along. A soldier's greatest victory isn't surviving the war. It's leaving behind a place where someone else never has to fight one. And before dawn painted the mountains gold. Jack Mercer slept peacefully through the entire night. Atlas lifted his head only once. He listened to the wind, confirmed that everything and everyone was safe. Then, with one final contented breath, he went back to sleep beside his oldest friend. If Jack and Atlas's journey reminded you that loyalty, courage, and hope can survive even the darkest seasons, leave a simple one in the comments. I'd love to know who stayed with them all the way to the end. And if you've ever believed that one faithful friend can change a life, leave a paw too. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story waiting on this channel may touch your heart just as deeply. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never stop believing that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't hidden in the mountains. They're found in the people and the companions who refuse to leave our side.